I love you most. That's what a 9-year-old king wrote to his big sister in 1546. She'd been visiting him for years, riding out to his nursery palaces, bringing gifts, holding him when no one else was allowed to. He was the only family she had left. 1 year later, he was on the throne. 4 years after that, he made her cry in front of the entire court, and she made him cry back. And before he turned 16, he sat down and signed a document that made sure she would never exist as queen. She would outlive him. She would take everything he built and burn it to the ground. And the sister who watched it all from the shadows, she would bury them both and leave one of their graves unmarked for 45 years. Christmas 1550, Westminster Palace. Edward was 13. Mary was 34. She hadn't seen him in months. She'd been avoiding court, hearing Mass in defiance of his laws, pretending she could hold the line without a confrontation. She couldn't. He summoned her. And when she stood before him in the great hall, surrounded by counselors and courtiers, the boy she'd rocked as an infant told her to stop practicing her faith. His voice was steady, rehearsed. She could hear his tutors in every word. Mary's hands were shaking. She told him he was too young to judge matters of religion. He told her the law applied even to his sister. She spoke, and her voice broke. When he answered, he didn't sound like her brother anymore. He sounded like their father. They were both crying by the end, the whole court watching. It was the last time they ever saw each other. Hold that. A teenage king and the woman who raised him, weeping in public. Not because they hated each other, but because they couldn't stop loving each other and couldn't stop fighting. The machine their father built gave them no exit. The affection was still there. It just didn't matter anymore. Here's what most people get wrong about Henry VIII's children. They assume the rivalry was built in from birth. 3 mothers, 3 religions, 3 enemies. Clean story. Also wrong. These 3 were the only safe people each other had. When Edward was born, in October of 1537, 21-year-old Mary stood as his godmother at the christening. 4-year-old Elizabeth tottered through the ceremony carrying the chrism cloth, the baptismal garment, almost as big as she was. Their mother, Jane Seymour, was dead within 12 days, which meant Mary, 21, unmarried, with nowhere else to go, became the closest thing to a mother that Edward would ever know. And she gave him everything she had. She rode out to his nursery palaces constantly. Her household accounts are full of it. Tips to his servants, gifts for his minstrels, a crimson jacket embroidered with pearls for the little prince, a length of yellow satin for Elizabeth. Coins slipped to Elizabeth for gambling, because apparently Tudor children gambled. Mary taught Edward how to carry himself at court. Elizabeth made him things with her own hands, once a shirt she'd sewn herself. In 1546, Edward wrote to Mary, and the words were simple. I love you most. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, pulled the family together for Christmas 1543, the first time all 3 children sat at the same table in years. Music, gifts, something that looked for a moment like an actual family. For a brief window, these weren't rivals. They were siblings, sharing the only childhood they were going to get. Hold that image, because everything that comes next destroys it. To understand how these 3 ended up tearing each other apart, you have to see what Henry VIII actually did to his succession. And it's worse than you think. One law made Mary illegitimate. 2 years later, another erased Elizabeth too. By 1536, Henry had 3 living children, and not one of them legally existed. Read that again. The king who broke with Rome, executed 2 wives, and shattered 1,000 years of English Christianity to produce a male heir, managed to bastardize every child he had. Then, in 1544, sensing he was running out of time and wives, he reversed course. A third act of succession put all three back in line: Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. But he never restored their legitimacy. They could inherit the crown. They were still, on paper, nobody's legitimate children. Queens in waiting built on a legal fiction. And here's the part nobody talks about. Each child had been raised with a different religious operating system installed at the deepest level. Mary, Catholic to the marrow, raised by Catherine of Aragon, shaped by watching her father destroy her mother's marriage, her faith, and her health. She clung to the old religion the way a drowning person clings to wood, because it was the only thing her mother left her. Edward, Protestant from birth, tutored by Cranmer's hand-picked reformers, trained to see the Mass as superstition and the Pope as the enemy. Elizabeth, Protestant too, but quieter about it. She'd seen what happened to people who believed too loudly. Her mother's head had come off for it. Henry didn't leave 3 heirs. He left 3 incompatible programs loaded onto the same machine. And each child's deepest conviction, the thing they held onto when everything else was taken, required them to destroy what the previous one built. Not as an option, as a duty. Edward became king at 9. By 12, he was no one's puppet. That's another myth that needs to die. This was a brilliant, driven boy who transformed England's religion with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely believed he was doing God's work. Latin Mass abolished, Catholic service books burned, churches stripped bare, walls whitewashed, altars broken apart, statues pulled down and smashed in the yards. A new Book of Common Prayer forced into every parish in the country. He wasn't a child playing king. He was a zealot who happened to be 15. And Mary became his problem. She wasn't just a Catholic sister. She was the living proof that the old faith still had royal blood behind it. Every time she heard Mass, openly, defiantly, in her own chapel with her household gathered around her, she was a challenge to everything he was building. The Privy Council wrote to her. Edward wrote to her personally. She wrote back that she was his most humble and obedient subject, but she would lay her head on a block before she used any service other than the one she was raised in. In March 1551, Mary didn't just come to court. She rode into London at the head of a procession of 400 men and women, every single one carrying a forbidden rosary in plain sight. The beads caught the light as they moved through the streets. It was theater, a dare, a woman telling a teenage boy with the power to kill her, "I'm still here. My God is still here. Do something about it." Edward confronted her again. Neither moved. And then his body started failing. By early 1553, the 15-year-old was dying. Probably tuberculosis with a secondary pulmonary infection. His lungs were filling with fluid. He coughed blood into cloths that had to be carried away so the court wouldn't see how dark they were getting. His fingernails turned blue. His hair was falling out. The smell in the room changed. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent his entire short life believing he was right, that the moment he stopped breathing, Mary would take the throne and rip out every reform he'd ever made, every prayer book, every statute, every whitewashed wall painted over again with saints, all of it undone, because she loved her God as much as he loved his. So the boy who once wrote, "I love you most," sat down and signed a document called the Device for the Succession. It didn't delay Mary. It didn't demote her. It erased her. Erased Elizabeth too, because legally you couldn't remove one without removing the other. Instead, the crown went to Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, conveniently married to the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England. 6 out of 15 judges refused to put their names on it. Northumberland needed 14 days to arrest Mary before Edward died. Edward gave him 6. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died. He was 15 years old. He never saw his sister again after that Christmas when they both cried, and his last political act on earth was making sure she would never be queen. If this is already changing how you see the Tudors, hit subscribe. We're not even halfway through what this family did to each other. Mary won. Jane Grey lasted 9 days. Northumberland was arrested, tried, executed. Mary rode into London with her army behind her, and the people cheering, Elizabeth at her side, holding her sister's hand in public, making the image of unity as clear as possible. And for a moment, it looked like it might hold. 2 sisters who had survived everything their father's machine could throw at them, finally on the same side. Mary was queen. Elizabeth was her heir. The nightmare was over. It lasted about 5 months. Mary was queen now, and she was running out of time before she even started. Her body was already failing her, even if she didn't fully know it yet. She was 37, unmarried, and her one mission was absolute: restore the Mass, restore the Pope, undo everything Edward had done, everything their father had started. But none of it would survive unless she had an heir, because if she died childless, Elizabeth would take the throne, and Elizabeth was Protestant, and the cycle would start again. So Mary married Philip of Spain, 11 years younger than her, a man who privately told his advisors she was older than he'd been promised and dressed badly. She was in love with him before the wedding. He was thinking about logistics. Then Wyatt's rebellion broke January 1554. A Protestant uprising aimed at stopping the Spanish marriage, and, though never openly declared, at putting Elizabeth on the throne. The evidence against Elizabeth was thin, but terrifying enough. Mary's council demanded she act. On March 17, 1554, 2 councillors arrived at Whitehall to escort Elizabeth to the Tower of London by river. Elizabeth asked for time to write a letter to her sister. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every word bought her seconds. Every sentence bought her minutes. She wrote slowly, deliberately, her hand steady even though she must have been terrified. She begged Mary to see her before condemning her. She swore she had never conspired against her sister. She signed her name. Then she picked up the pen again and drew diagonal lines across every remaining inch of blank paper, so that no one could forge additional words beneath her signature. By the time she finished, the tide on the Thames had turned. The boats couldn't pass safely under the arches of London Bridge. She'd bought herself one more night. The letter, known ever since as the Tide Letter, is one of the most desperate documents in English history. Mary never read it. When she heard about the delay, she was furious. The next day, Palm Sunday, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower. She was housed in the royal apartments in the inner ward, the same rooms Henry VIII had renovated for her mother, Anne Boleyn's coronation. The same rooms where Anne Boleyn had slept the nights before her execution. Elizabeth walked through a palace her father built for her mother to be crowned in, and her mother had last seen on the way to the scaffold. Mary put Elizabeth in her mother's death chamber. There is no record that she chose this deliberately. There is also no record that she didn't. Elizabeth spent 2 months there. She told her gentleman usher one night, "For this night I think to die." She didn't. Wyatt was executed and used his last breath to proclaim her innocence. There was never enough evidence. Mary let her go, eventually, into house arrest. They reached something that looked, from the outside, like peace. Elizabeth attended Mass. Mary softened her grip. For a while, neither sister tested the other. But it wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. And it wouldn't last, Because Mary's body was about to make every political question irrelevant. Mary's body betrayed her. Twice, she believed she was pregnant. Twice, the court prepared for a royal birth. Physicians confirmed it. A cradle was brought to her chambers. And twice, nothing. No child. Her abdomen swelled anyway. Her health collapsed. Modern historians believe it was ovarian or uterine cancer, slowly consuming her from the inside, while the court pretended to wait for a baby that was never coming. Philip left. He went back to Spain, then to Brussels, and he barely returned. He had his own wars, his own empire, his own problems. Mary wrote to him. He sent polite replies. She was dying in a palace full of people who were already looking past her. By November 1558, the women of Mary's own household, the ladies who dressed her, who sat with her through the phantom pregnancies, who watched her weep when Philip's letters stopped coming, were quietly sending messages to Elizabeth at Hatfield, preparing for the transition. Mary knew. She could see them pulling away. Her counselors came less often. The rooms grew quieter. On November 17th, 1558, Mary ordered Mass celebrated in her room one final time. Her ladies thought she fell asleep at the end of the service. She hadn't. She was dead. She was 42. Her will asked to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, at Peterborough. Elizabeth ignored the request. Mary was buried at Westminster Abbey, and for the next 45 years, the entirety of Elizabeth's reign, there was nothing on the grave but unmarked stones. London celebrated. Bonfires in the streets, tables of food dragged out for feasting, church bells ringing, all for Elizabeth. But here's the part most people never hear. Less than 2 months after Mary died, her husband asked to marry her sister. Same crown, different woman. Philip wrote to his ambassador in January 1559 that he could not afford to lose England. It didn't matter which Tudor wore the ring, as long as the country stayed his. Elizabeth declined, diplomatically. But the message was already delivered. To Philip, the wife and the sister were interchangeable. The woman on the throne was a detail. The throne was the point. Most channels stopped this story at Mary's death. If you want the version nobody tells, subscribe. I'm not done. Step back. Look at this from above. See what Henry actually built. He broke with Rome, executed 2 wives, bastardized all 3 of his children, passed 3 contradictory laws about who could inherit his throne, installed incompatible religions in each of them, all to secure a Protestant male dynasty that would last centuries. Edward ruled 6 years, died at 15, no children. Mary ruled 5 years, died at 42, no children. Elizabeth ruled 45 years, died at 69, no children. 3 heirs, 3 reigns, 0 continuation. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, the Catholic rival Elizabeth had beheaded. Every single thing Henry did to prevent that outcome led directly to it. Edward's fanaticism guaranteed Mary's counter-reformation. Mary's counter-reformation guaranteed Elizabeth's Protestant restoration. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, shaped, almost certainly, by watching what marriage did to her sister and what men did to her mother, guaranteed the extinction of the line. Henry didn't build a dynasty. He built a self-destruct sequence with a 56-year fuse. And the 3 children who lit it, who once shared music and gifts and the same terrifying father, spent their adult lives burning down each other's life's work. Not because they wanted to, because the machine gave them nothing else to do. But there's one more image. And once you see it, you can't look at this story the same way. In 1606, James I ordered Elizabeth's coffin moved. He had it placed in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey, directly on top of Mary's coffin, in a narrow vault barely large enough for both. He built a marble monument above them. Elizabeth's effigy on top, regal, glittering. Mary's name appears only in a Latin inscription on the base. Small letters, easy to miss. It reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of the resurrection." Elizabeth's coffin rests on Mary's, pressing down on it, for over 400 years. Mary asked to be buried with her mother. That wish was ignored. Elizabeth never asked to be buried with Mary. That was imposed by James, the son of the woman Elizabeth had executed, rearranging the dead to write his own version of peace. In 1867, the vault was briefly opened. Through a small crack in the stone, observers described the two coffins compressed together in the closest possible grasp. Two sisters who once sat at the same table at Christmas, who slipped each other coins to gamble with, who sewed shirts for a little brother they both adored, pressed together in the dark long after the last argument ended. Neither of them ever got what she was fighting for. Mary never saved the faith. Elizabeth never secured the line. The dynasty their father broke the world to build died with them. The inscription says they sleep in hope of the resurrection. It doesn't say whether, when that morning comes, they'd finally make peace or start the whole argument over again.